A gun trembles in my hand like a thing that remembers how it was used long before I learned its weight. The metal is cold, heavier than the promise I made to a child who could not lift it, and the man before me kneels in the pool of his own making, blood dark and slow across his collarbone, defiant even as the breath leaves him in ragged pulls. My finger tightens on the trigger because tightening is what I was taught to do when the world bent toward me like a fist, because for years every calculation, every stolen meal, every scar was a small step toward this one articulated movement. All my life I waited for this moment, so I tell myself now, the thought a thread I repeat to keep steady, yet there is a hollow under that sentence, a quietly growing question I have not allowed myself until I am standing so close I can see the small tremor of the man's eyelids. Why does it feel wrong? I remember the slums like a map burned into my palms, the lean corrugated roofs, children with hollow cheeks arguing over a crust of bread, rain that came down like an accusation and turned alleys to rivers. I remember the day men in black coats came with the easy cruelty of men whose hands have never known hunger. My father stood between the men and our door because he thought words still mattered. They taught him otherwise. They dragged him through the mud as I watched from a doorway small enough to hide a boy, his coat torn, his face a thing split open and unrecognizable. They said the name like a benediction and a verdict, Don Valente, and the sound of it filled the alley like smoke. I saw the world tilt then, as if some hidden axis had been moved. It left a cast shadow over everything that followed. Revenge became the grammar I learned to speak when the adults around me used softer words for the same hunger, survival, justice, debt. I promised myself I would learn everything the men in black coats knew, how to wait, how to make people trust you until the moment you chose to take them down. I learned new names for my old rage, folded it into silence and patience until it fit into a uniform I could wear among those who had caused me to choose this life. So I came to the man who wore that name, the one whose laugh had echoed in the alley like a bell before the blow fell. I entered his world under a false name, a soldier among soldiers, smiling at jokes I hadn't been invited to and carrying burdens I never spoke of. I rose because it was useful to rise. Every promotion placed me nearer the man whose shadow had been my tutor, who trusted me with the kind of small cruelties that built empires. And then she appeared, as impossible as sunlight on concrete, Elena, his daughter, moving through the compound like someone who did not know she was invisible to the poor. She had a way of looking at things as if they had not yet been decided, as if she might choose mercy and that choice would mean something. Her kindness was not a show, it was small and stubborn, a habit of giving bread to the forgotten or asking the cleaners their names when others passed them like furniture. The first time our eyes met there was the quietest theft, a look that took something from me that I had not planned to lose. In the months that followed, I stood between murder and laughter, learning how her laugh sounded when she thought no one listened, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the little calluses at the base of her fingers from piano lessons she never spoke about. I thought the old hunger would only grow sharper, but instead it became complicated, sharpness tempered by colors I had stopped seeing. I stood at her bedside when fevers took her as if I were two different men, one made of calculation and the other of a tenderness I had kept under lock and key. Love arrived like a small mutiny. It did not ask permission, it simply unrolled an argument inside me so persuasive I almost believed it might be true, that there could be another end to this story besides the neat snapping of a neck. But the past is a patient animal and revenge has habits that do not die when you love someone. The days of quiet proximity built into an intolerable knot. I was both the man who had learned to aim and the one who found his hand softening when she reached for his sleeve. I carried unsent letters to a grave I could not find, tracing the lines of a promise I owed to a ghost. Every time the Don chuckled in the office and clapped me on the shoulder, I felt a poison bloom, gratitude for a man who had never been kind to my family, shame at how much I had come to resemble someone I had sworn to destroy. The world around us tightened like a wound. Rival factions sniffed the air for weakness, old debts were called in like overdue loans, and in the half-light of rooms where men pretended to joke about business, there were knives being sharpened and plans being written in invisible ink. The slums whispered my name sometimes because children there saw me in the wrong clothes and recognized the way my father had carried himself, and the sight of me reminded them that nothing truly changes unless someone makes it change with a bullet or a law. There was a moment, a small pivot, when everything threatened to fold, a file left on a desk, a guard who knew too much, an ally who looked at me with the kind of pity friends do not usually afford the damned. I found out that the man who had fired the gun that killed my father was not the one I had imagined. The truth was more crooked, more human, which made it worse. Marco Santino's fingerprints were on the act, but the decision had been communal, swallowed and rearranged in the dark rooms of the Don's Council. The story I had constructed, the one with a single villain who could be purged to restore balance, began to fray. And when Elena discovered the unsent pages tucked in my coat, her face collapsed in a way that felt like the collapse of a small country. She asked me to leave before her father found out. She said words about safety that felt like verdicts. In that instant the impossible question I had been hiding behind finally spoke aloud. When revenge becomes love, who does the heart obey? I lowered my eyes to the gun, to the man bleeding and waiting for my verdict. The room seemed to shrink to the size of the decision. Around me the empire held its breath. The boy from the alley and the man who had learned to kill stood shoulder to shoulder and both looked at the same crossroads, each convinced in equal measure that his path was right. I had journeyed into the belly of the beast to learn its secrets, thinking I would emerge triumphant with the head of my enemy. Instead I had found a woman who made me wonder if my victory would merely hollow me out. The answer was not yet written. The trigger did not move. They called me Luca Romano when I first walked through the iron gates of Valente's world, a name chosen for its ordinary sound, for the way it slid off a tongue without history. My real name was Adrian Moretti, a name that smelled of vinegar and bread crusts and the alley where my childhood learned to keep its head down. I can still remember the scrape of the gutters under my feet, the geometry of trash piles and puddles that taught me how to move without making room for anyone else. My youth was ledgered in small thefts, a loaf of bread tucked under a jacket, a coin lifted from a distracted hand, a scrap of meat wrested from the back of a market stall. There were fights over territory and respect. Dogs gnawed the marrow from bones while we argued who deserved the scraps. People who've never learned to fear hunger call hunger simple. For us, it was a tutor with a cruel curriculum, and it taught me patience as much as it taught me how to take. My father's hands were broad and honest in ways that had no place in our streets. He was the kind of man who would stop to help a neighbor carry water, who would argue with shopkeepers if a pound of flour was light by a handful. He was framed the way you frame a painting, by someone with power and taste for cruelty. They put a story on him, a crime he did not commit, and the story stuck. The day they took him, men in dark coats moved through our lane with the efficiency of memory, and I watched from the shadow of a doorway as they dragged him by the collar through mud and rain. I watched the world rearrange itself around that moment, as if a hidden hinge had been shifted and everything I had thought steady began to tilt. Don Valente's name was a bell that day, a sound that meant more than rumor, it meant verdict. I learned early that names could be weapons and reverence could be a sentence. After my father's death I promised myself a single economy, revenge. The promise was simple because the hunger was simple. A child's vow hardened into a plan as I learned every craft that would let me enter the thing that had killed him. I learned to lie without flinching. I learned to smile and fold my plans into that smile. I read faces the way other boys read newspapers, gleaning lines that gave away loyalty and lines that betrayed fear. Years have a way of smoothing the anxious edges of a plan into a trajectory. What began as a boy's raw need became a man's careful assent. There was an artist's patience to it, watching where power gathered, where it leaked, what it fed upon, and moving into the places no one else noticed. Don Valente's empire was a geography of taste and shadow, gambling dens with green felt tables and secrets traded like currency, the docks where crates moved under the cover of night and the seaside as if it carried bargains in its belly, and the higher offices where men in suits shook hands with politicians and smiled at reporters while the real arrangements were made in backrooms with locked doors. It was a world where loyalty had a price and betrayal had a receipt you could pay with blood. I entered that world under the false name because a false name buys you time and anonymity, it buys you the ability to watch. I apprenticed in small cruelties, doing errands and favors that built a ledger of trust. In public I was calm, a man whose quiet made others lower their guard. Under the skin, a patient storm gathered. My eyes catalogued patterns, who deferred to whom, which smiles were real and which were performance, which drinks were spiked and which were safe. I learned to be useful before I became dangerous. Then the inciting moment arrived with the kind of suddenness cunning plans never anticipate. A rival family, greedy and miscalculated, bled into Valente's routes, men jumping from shadow to seize a shipment that was supposed to be secure. The attack was clean and ugly, gunfire blooming like flowers of iron, crates split and spilled into the street as if the sea itself had come ashore with malice. In the crush, a bullet found the dawn. One of the men, the one whose laugh could cut a room in half, fell in a slow heap, blood dark and indiscriminate, the kind of scene that makes men who live by cause and effect rethink their odds. I did not think, not in a way that my father's ghost would have recognized as noble. I did what I had been cultivating, I moved. I shot the attacker who would have finished the dawn, a single action that was more seam than revelation. It was the stitching of a life slowly reassembled. The dawn's eyes found me then, sharp and assessing, and for the first time I stepped out of the background of movements I had rehearsed and into a light that felt as dangerous as a blade. He rewarded the act with something more valuable than gratitude, trust. Trust in that world buys you proximity to the heart of things, the kitchen where plans are simmered, the rooms where loyalty is measured. Proximity was an altar at which I worshipped quietly, it was also a vantage point. From closer to the dawn I watched the rhythms of his days, the way he cursed the rain when shipments were late, the way he demanded loyalty the way others demanded taxes. And in the generous places where his attention softened, Elena Valente moved like a wind that did not know it carried storms. She was not beautiful the way paintings teach women to be beautiful, she was beautiful in a manner that disarmed the kind of weaponry my life had sharpened, fearless, curious, and with a kindness that operated like contraband. Elena's laugh did not announce itself, it bided and then bloomed, and she asked questions that made people answer in ways they had not planned to. She had an interest in people that was not servile and an impatience with cruelty that did not pretend to be naive. The first time our paths crossed it was in a courtyard where lemon trees grew against whitewashed walls, and she asked me simply if I liked the music that an old radio was playing. It was a small question, but it landed with the force of an anvil in the private chamber where I had kept my plans under lock and key. Her kindness disarmed me because it asked nothing in return and because it made a demand my father's memory had not allowed, that I consider more than a single ledger of accounts. She watched the world and catalogued its hurts in a way that made me ashamed of the ledger I had become. I found myself inventing excuses to be near her, to walk past the rooms where she played with stray dogs, to stand where her shadow fell on the terrace as if the sun itself had conspired to slow me down. Her presence complicated things. Where once vengeance was a near mathematical certainty, if I executed step A, then step B would be required and justice would be achieved, now there were variables I had not accounted for. A glance could reset an equation. I began to imagine outcomes where the dawn's kindness toward me did not dissolve into triumph for the ruin I had planned. The boy who had grown up counting the ways a man could be diminished by violence started to hesitate because another thing had intervened, a light-footed compassion that felt like a betrayal of the oath I had made at my father's funeral. The world I had entered was merciless, it pays in coin and takes in blood, and loyalty is the small currency passed between men who know a knife will someday be turned. Yet in the folds of that cruelty I discovered a softness that was more dangerous than an enemy's blade, because it was internal and because it required a form of surrender I had never trained for. Standing beside the dawn, a man whose laughter still echoed in my memory with the cadence of the day my father was taken, I felt that old pain and a new tenderness occupy the same small space in my chest. The inciting wound had changed me, the shot that saved Don Valente's life opened a door I had not planned to open, and beyond it stood a woman who made the old lines wobble. I carried the question like a coin in my pocket, cold and constant. Can a man built for revenge learn to love without betraying himself? I rose through Valente's ranks the way a tide takes a shoreline, slow, inevitable, unnoticed until the land is already gone. They began to trust me for the very thing I had honed in the gutters, unflinching usefulness. I learned names the way others learn prayers, and I learned where conversations folded into conspiracy, who paid debts with favors and who paid favors with silence. The Don watched me with a look that often softened around the edges, and I felt myself folded into a family I had designed only to penetrate. He began to call me son in private jokes and public boasts, the words dropping like golden coins from a hand that had never known want. That designation was a weapon and a gift, a weapon because it blurred the lines between the role I'd adopted and the role I had been assigned by blood, and a gift because proximity to Valente meant access to rooms where maps were drawn and fates were quietly decided. With each promotion, an entrusted transport, a quiet meeting attended, a favor handled without question, I moved from the periphery into the flaming heart of the machine that had once ground my family into dust. I watched the Don's mannerisms the way an actor learns the cadence of a role, cataloging how he laughed at small jokes, how he stood when he was angry, the way his hands always sought the arm of a chair when decisions weighed heavy. The deeper I went, the more his trust tethered me to a life I had only ever intended to inhabit until revenge could be taken. And there was Elena, whose presence in the house became the small sun around which the household's shadow spun, who complicated that tether in ways my plans had not accounted for. She began to spend time with me in ways that were not calculated, in ways that felt like accidents the first few times and then like inevitable truths. We shared silences that were not awkward but instructive. She listened in a manner I had rarely encountered, and when she laughed it was as if a door somewhere in me had been unlatched. Her curiosity was not the idle curiosity of the privileged, it was a fierce attention that wanted to see the world for what it was, not only for the stories that made others comfortable. She learned the names of the cleaners and the cooks, she questioned a guard's sudden absence with a steadiness that made him look smaller, and she carried with her a moral gravity that made ordinary cruelties appear petty and unnecessary. The connection between us deepened without spectacle, a touch that lasted a fraction too long when passing plates, a look that lingered near the horizon of confession, conversations about small things that somehow became the scaffolding of intimacy. It was soft and it was dangerous because love, real love, the kind that insists on seeing your edges, rearranges priorities, and priorities were the very scaffolding of my original mission. My loyalty, once as ironclad as any armor, began to itch in places I had not known could feel. Then came orders that tested the mettle of what I had become. The day they brought the accusation against Mateo, the kid whose rump I had warmed on the same bench as a child, was the day the ledger asked for a reckoning. Mateo's face was weathered beyond what his years should have allowed, he had scars from past scraps and a laugh that had once been part of my survival soundtrack. They said he had betrayed Valente, had sold a route to a rival for a bottle of liquor, and in that house of whispered truths such words were as good as nails hammered into a coffin. My mouth tasted of iron when the order arrived. I had learned to obey because disobedience in Valente's world did not end with a reprimand, it ended with an absence that your family would answer in grief. And so I followed the instruction. I met Mateo in the yard, where the citrus trees smelled of sun and something like memory, and I watched him plead in the way only people under the smothering weight of accusation can plead. I told myself afterward that I had given him an easier death than the one politics would have arranged. I told myself the necessary lies that men in my position tell to sleep. But the moment I pulled the trigger, some small collapse happened inside me. A fracture that was not loud enough to be noticed by others widened in private. That night I washed the smell of gun oil from my hands until the skin peeled, and I felt the ledger tilt unevenly. The account of my loyalty paid in my friend's blood, and a new item on the list, a cost I had not intended to accept, added itself with quiet cruelty. The action should have steeled me, should have made the rest of my decisions clearer by the clarity of sacrifice, instead it made everything murkier. The shell that had protected the boy in the gutters was cracking, and the cracks let in light that revealed unwanted things. The command I received after Mateo's death felt like a test devised to break me. Infiltrate a resistance group rumored to be gathering strength against the Valente Empire. It was, on its face, a simple espionage assignment: gain their trust, report their plans, neutralize threats. But the world is rarely content with simple arrangements, and the further I leaned into the resistance's orbit, the more I discovered a jumble of motives that blurred lines I had learned to hold neat. I met teachers and dock workers there, women who stitched uniforms for soldiers by day and stitched their mouths with silence by night. I met men who had lost brothers to enforced disappearances and who had learned to turn grief into a method of organization. They spoke of justice in a way that made me uneasy because it lacked the jaggedness of revenge and instead bore the steady, quizzical weight of people who wanted a different tomorrow. And then I found a folder, misplaced in an office no one had thought to lock, and the folder changed everything. It was not conclusive proof of the Don's hand in my father's death, but it was a map of decisions and minutes and signatures that showed a council had deliberated and given orders. Marco Santino's name was threaded through it, the man who loved power like a man loves needlework, precise and unrepentant. Marco had pulled triggers and made offers in his time, but the documents suggested a community verdict. Valente had not personally raised a gun, but he had been part of a vote that authorized the action that left my father lifeless in a gutter. The revelation tasted like ash. I had designed my life to strike at a single figure. The truth that emerged was not cinematic and pure but messy and collective, which made it all the more corrosive. Rage flickered, hot and instant, the kind of heat that asks for immediate reciprocation. I imagined confrontations that would be brutal and simple, force returned as force. But then my mind returned to Elena, her hands, the particular way she voiced outrage at waste, the conviction that people could change when someone gave them reason. Her eyes had often stopped me in the simplest way, a look that did not demand explanations but refused to let me hide. In the quiet hours, when the house slept and the city hummed with its sullen neon lullaby, I began writing letters to my father that I never intended to send. They were confessions and accusations, the kinds of entries a man makes when he can no longer tell himself the old stories. I wanted revenge, I would write, laying out the ledger like an offering, but she makes me want something I don't deserve, peace. The sentence felt like both a plea and a betrayal. I folded the pages and slid them into pockets of coats I never cleaned, and each time I did so I felt the faithful architecture of my purpose tremble. My internal struggle grew cumbersome and loud. It was no longer a private shadow but an edifice occupying my days, one room for the ghost of my father, one room warmed by Elena's presence, both demanding occupancy. Could I avenge the dead without killing the living part of myself? The question moved through me like a rumor. In the house where men measured loyalty with ledger entries and reparations, my ledger read differently. Payments were being demanded from the very account I had thought to spend only on the man who had taken my father. I had come into Valente's orbit to trade in a single currency, revenge, but the economy had altered itself around compassion, around responsibilities to flesh and face, and suddenly my austerity measures felt immoral. The resistance whispered of uprisings and petitions and slow-burning methods that did not satisfy the hollowness that had once motivated me, and Marco plotted with the crispness of a man who liked his solutions quick and clean. Elena, when she learned of the resistance's existence and asked not to be involved but to understand, looked at me with a trust that felt like a charge. She believed I was different. She believed I could be more than a ledger. Her belief was both a shield and a machete. It protected me from myself and also cut into the line I had drawn in my heart. The ghost of my father marched through my nights, the unsent letters piled like unused weapons, and I found myself asking, with an honesty that felt like surrender, whether the violence I trained for could be rendered obsolete by the very thing that had softened me, love. The file arrived like an accident at first, left on a courier's desk, misfiled between invoices and the kind of banal paper that usually contains the world's smallest betrayals. I had been sent to collect payment for a shipment that had already been counted and counted again. The men at the desk were bored and careless, and in that boredom I found the opening I had learned to look for all my life. I did not plan to look at it. I told myself that as I slid the manila folder toward me and found the folded pages, the kind of documents that smell faintly of tobacco and old ink. They fit into my hand like the kind of thing a man might hold if he wanted the world to make sense, a ledger of meetings, initials beside minutes, decisions glossed into polite sentences that disguised their gravity. The folder was designed to be opaque. It included votes and signatures and the kind of administrative voice that made complicity sound reasonable. And there, threaded through the minutes like a crooked seam, was Marco Santino's name, his handwriting on a note, a marginal comment, the kind of small mark men leave when they mean to watch things unfold from behind the curtain. I felt time shift inside me as if the room had tilted, the pages rearranged the architecture of my life. For years I had carried a neat narrative in my head, a single man who was the author of the night my father died, a figure against whom I could shape a revenge that would make the world feel titled properly again. That story had been an economy that paid in certainty. The file burned that certainty to ash. It showed not a monstrous villain with a single smoking gun, but a council's minutes, a agreeing chorus, a collective moving of hands and making of decisions that left a man dead in an alley. The truth was messy, democratic, and therefore somehow crueler. It showed that Valente had argued, quietly, in a way I understood now as a kind of culpable human failing, to spare my father. He had proposed leniency, a fine perhaps, or exile, some measure that would not end a life. But the council had voted otherwise, the motion passed, and with the pass came the arrangement that put a gun in the right place at the right time. Marco's fingerprints were literal and figurative. He had pulled the trigger, or had arranged for it to be pulled, and he had smiled while others signed their assent. The knowledge rearranged the beats of my heart. It is one thing to learn that the man you want to punish is not purely villainous, it is another to discover the human compromises that feed monstrous outcomes. I felt both revelation and a nausea like seasickness, as if the map had been redrawn under my feet. In the days that followed, the revelation landed like a stone in my pocket, dense, cold, and impossible to deny. I imagined scenes like those I had practiced at night in my small apartment, confrontations in the dawn study, the old man's hand trembling as he confessed an error, the sharp, satisfying pop of justice as retribution was delivered. The fantasy was childish and clean. The file did not allow fantasies. It demanded a different kind of response, one that accounted for the complexity and cruelty of decision-making in a world where men traded lives like currency. The more I read, the more the truth refracted into angles I had not seen. Marco was not simply an executioner, he was a surgeon of ambition. He had carved and sutured alliances with the surgeon's calm that quiets you into cooperation. He had been patient in ways that made my own patience look like a child's tantrum. And he had designs beyond the vote that had killed my father, a map of routes, a ledger of loyalties to be pried loose, names of politicians who would become useful and names of soldiers who would be dispensable. The file suggested a coup in the making, the kind of careful, administrative violence that eats an empire from the inside. As I understood more, something like a second death took place inside me, the death of the tidy vengeance I had rehearsed my whole adult life. If Valente had at least argued to save my father, then the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. There was no single straw to break the camel's back. Instead, there was an architecture of decisions made by many hands, each with motives, each with a type of moral calculus that left a body in the street. The revelation did not cleanse me. It complicated rather than absolved. What was worse, and more dangerous, was that the file was provisional. The existence of the document meant there were others who kept similar ledgers, and once you knew such ledgers existed you became a thing that other men could, and would, use. Marco's plan was not merely to seize the machinery of the Valente Empire, he planned to rewrite the ethics of governance there. He would prune the softer branches and make loyalty a currency to be redistributed. That knowledge changed my priorities, or at least it pulled my priorities into focus like a lens. I had intended, for years, to extinguish an individual. Now I saw that a sick tree would continue to seed 100 poisonous branches if left to grow. It required a different kind of intervention, surgical, brutal, and precise. The more I considered the problem, the more I realized how insufficient my old tactics would be. I could kill Marco and feel a brief warmth, but his network would still have roots. If I could not change the soil, vengeance would only feed the rot. The file also contained a detail that felt like a personal attack, a note that Marco had flagged several men he suspected of weakness, names, addresses, his neat script spelling out an efficiency I had seen mimic in his interactions. My own name appeared on one of these lists, not as a suspicion but as an opportunity. Someone had whispered to Marco about the man named Luca Romano. He had been surveilling patterns, noticing anomalies, and the file's margin bore that faint suggestion as both a threat and a promise. I had taken precautions, of course. I had drowned my past under a false name and a practiced face. I had not expected, however, that the delicate filigree of Marco's mind would catch the shadow I left like a moth. There was a harrowing finality to the realization that a puppet master had noticed the strings I had thought hidden. I did not sleep that night. I imagined the world in which Marco chose to expose me, the Don's face folding in confusion and rage, the household's sudden cold. I felt the brittle ingenuity of men like Marco, men who understand leverage as if it were muscle and whose favored tools are humiliation and blackmail. It was no surprise, then, that he chose leverage. He cornered me with a proposition in the kind of room where deals are made on the back of ashtrays and broken metaphors. He did not raise his voice. Men like Marco speak in a tone that assumes you will hear reason, and reason is rarely kind. He told me, with the casual cruelty of someone discussing weather, that he had learned who I was. He had discovered Adrian Moretti in the seams of Luca Romano. He did not threaten to kill me, at least not at first. He threatened to expose me to Valente, to pull back the curtain and show the Don the man who had nursed a private vendetta in his house. The choice he offered was perfectly perverse. Join me, Marco said, and take hand and crown from a man whose hesitation and humanity made him weak. Refuse, and I tell Valente everything in a way that will make mercy seem like deceit. I remember the quiet in the room when the offer landed. Marco's eyes were like a scalpel through silk. He preferred to cut and watch the slow unravel. The proposition was simple math made moral. Side with me and secure power and protection. Side against me and be damned by your own secret. The ethical cruelty in that choice was deliberate. He forced me to consider treason as survival and wanted me to weigh my love for Elena against the possibility of unchecked slaughter beneath Marco's hard hand. I insisted I would never join him. The words felt like nails hammered in a door. I told him what he wanted to hurt, that I had reasons he could not imagine for being where I was, and he answered with amusement, as if motives were toys for men who enjoyed the theater of others' pain. He smiled and told me he would give me until the banquet, an artificial deadline that lurched through me like an earthquake. I left Marco's room with the sensation that I had walked from the mouth of a beast into a world that now smelled of the same beast. I thought I could fix things. I thought, in the bleached way of a desperate man, that if I could arm truth and fling it like a grenade, revelation would topple the structures and the Don would look at his hands and change. I had believed truth to be a kind of weapon, blind and righteous. The file taught me that truth is not always pure. It is heavy with all the hands that have touched it and all the motives that shaped it. In my precarious imaginings I decided to control the disclosure, to take the file and present it to Valente at a moment when he would be forced to reckon with the choices of the past. But before I could act, something else ruptured the small world we had made. Elena found my letters. She discovered them in a coat I had left in a room I had shared with a friend. She found the papers folded and tucked in a pocket like small accidents waiting to be noticed. The discovery was quiet and brutal. Her face changed in a way that made me think of glass breaking, swift, crystalline fragments that could not be reassembled exactly as they had been. The trust between us, which had been a fragile contraband of tenderness, shattered into honest, dangerous shards. She read and understood in a way that left no room for negotiation. She realized who I was, and the story she had told herself about the man she cared for, about his motives, his integrity, collapsed under the weight of my unsent confessions. Elena demanded I leave before her father found out, not because she wanted to punish me but because she wanted to preserve a system of safety that she believed still had good in it. Her plea was both a compassionate attempt to protect me and an indictment of the house I had come to inhabit. She warned me of the danger my presence posed not only to myself but to the fragile peace she imagined could exist inside the family's protected walls. I tried to explain. I tried to show her the file and the complexity of the truth. She would not hear it. Her trust had been violated in a way that made explanation a meanness. She wanted distance between us before the Don could face a betrayal of a different kind. In that moment, the world felt reduced to a single strange question that cut through everything I thought I knew. Is truth a weapon, something you can aim at a target and expect a precise effect, or is it a curse that, once freed, changes everyone's shapes and demands new reckonings? The night the house erupted felt like the world finally obeyed the shape of the violence we had been arranging for years, as if fate had been patient and then decided to stop waiting. The Valente estate glittered with its borrowed grandeur, crystal chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, tables laid with white linen and silver that caught the light in a way that made everything appear sanctified. Men and women in tailored suits and silk dresses moved like fish in a well-fed tank, exchanging contained laughter and pledges that sounded like instructions. It was the Don's anniversary, an evening dressed for theater, and there was an ease in the air because people who own stories learn to pretend their endings are permanent. I remember the way the music hummed under conversation, a lullaby for those who believed nothing terrible would press its face to the glass tonight. I remember thinking, with a private cruel humor, that this would be the perfect night to unravel the show. Marco chose his moment with a surgeon's patience. The coup did not walk in wearing banners, it seeped through the estate like oil, dark and almost invisible until the floor itself slickened. Men in the household shifted positions, a waiter suddenly in two places, a guard absent who had been posted at the north gate. Then the lights lopped in a way that made shadows long and merciless. Panic moves in the chest with a particular economy, it commandeers breath and makes limbs find the nearest instruction. Gunfire arrived like music gone wrong, staccato percussion that split a speech mid-syllable, the way a dropped glass renders a room brittle. Glass broke, the orchestra of plates clattered to the floor, and in the prettily lit chaos figures we had known for years unmasked themselves with gestures that revealed everyone's true nature, some small, some monstrous. Marco's men had counted on confusion, they had timed their entry to the waltz of the evening and unrolled their knives and pistols like a dark blossom. I moved because movement is what I had been trained for and because my body no longer only belonged to me. I felt an automatic prioritization, first protect the Dawn, then Elena, then the fragile scaffolding that keeps a household intact. The Don's face went from amused to animal in the space of a heartbeat. He bellowed orders that were both authoritative and prayer-like. His men, in the first breath of betrayal, performed like trained animals, some confused but bound by habit. I did not think of my plans then. Plans had been replaced by instinct, every small muscle in me knew the choreography of violence. I found myself leaping across tables, catching a falling chandelier's glitter in the periphery and using the distraction to pull a man to the ground. I fired at other men who lunged for the Don's flank, the crack of my weapon sounded more distant than my heartbeat. People screamed, some in prayer, some in the simple panic of being alive, and the mansion became a sound sculpture of fear. Through the smoke and the falling confetti of napkins, I saw Elena, small and luminous, moving toward the commotion as if she could soothe it by presence alone. She was not meant for the kinds of rooms where men resolved disputes with bullets, she was meant for sunlit courtyards and conversations that did not leave stains. I saw her duck behind a massive pillar as a man in a dark suit rounded it, his eyes hungry with someone else's orders. I did not give myself the option of watching, I moved. I reached her as a cloud of cheap smoke, gas to disorient, rolled along the floor. My shoulder slammed into the man's chest, he fell backward with an oath that tasted like surprise. For a second the world narrowed to the cadence of our breathing and the taste of iron, and then the noises reasserted themselves. The coureurs advanced with an efficiency that made me admire and hate them simultaneously. For a heartbeat I felt admiration for their discipline, and hatred for the cause they served. Marco's plan was a machine, and I had stepped into its gears. I fought through blood and smoke and the ragged fragments of human voice. I dragged the Don away from an open door where a group of soldiers had tried to make entry, and for a moment Valente's eyes found mine. There was an old man's recognition there, like the look someone gives a soldier they have trained and then betrayed, and in it I read an ocean of possible confessions that would never be given. Behind me chaos became pure arithmetic, shots, bodies, a man I had not noticed drop a tray and then slump. The estate servants performed miracles of bravery, the young cooks who had been invisible until now appeared like ghosts of my own past, pushing furniture to block corridors, screaming at terrified guests to the stairways. In the middle of the tumult a figure appeared, Marco, as composed as a man arriving for supper, walking through the splintered glass as if he had been rehearsing his entrance. He had the calm of someone who keeps a chessboard in his heart. His smile was precise and clinical. He had orchestrated this to perfection. Men who had once smiled easily at him now turned and either followed or were cut down with a remorseless clarity that spoke of well-established hierarchies in this new order he sought. And then, like a line delivered with the exquisite cruelty of a playwright, Marco seized what he needed to make the spectacle complete: Elena. She was in the corridor, perhaps hoping to find me, perhaps trying to help, when he stepped from the smoke and took her like a man reaching for a trophy. 1 second she was there, the next she was being dragged by the wrist, her face shocked and then resolute, eyes flashing at me with a question I couldn't answer. Marco had chosen not to kill, he had chosen a far more painful weapon: exposure. He held her like a shield and in that motion removed any shroud that had covered me. This one, Marco announced to the room with the measured venom of a man enjoying the anatomy of his triumph, is the wolf's son. The words were a hammer. Valente turned to me with a rage that did not quite make sense, because rage without context is only the reflection of confusion. The Don's face was a map of anger and bewilderment. How could his protector be the son of the man his council had once condemned? Marco's men cheered like a chorus, and the house, which had been an island of luxury, became the stage for the ruin of reputations. I watched the movement as if it were happening to someone else, hands pulling guns, the Don's men stepping back, shock pulling the household into a tableau of accusation. Marco's voice, rich and triumphant, narrated my fall from provisional grace. He moved with the ease of a man who has written the ending and mailed himself the applause. The room wanted a villain, and I fit the part in a way that felt almost theatrical. My first reaction was a mechanical recitation of what I had practiced for, the denial. But the room had been rigged. Secrets cannot swim in stormwater forever without being noticed. The truth, tangled and heavy, slid from my coat like an unsheathed blade. I did not lie. Adrian Moretti, I said, and the name tasted like the first rain on dry pavement. It was the sound of the boy I had been and the man I had become all at once. When I said it, there was a sound like fabric tearing. Elena's face folded into an expression of disbelief and betrayal that made even the bullet seem silly. She looked at me as if I had been a painting she had trusted and now found smeared. Valente's eyes caught the word and his bewilderment deepened into an animal's hunting focus. "You came here to destroy me," I told him in a voice that did not tremble because truth had a gravity that steadied me, "but she saved me." Marco laughed, a short, ugly sound like the clack of a knife. He stepped forward, aiming a gun at Valente with a theatricality as if he were announcing a prize. "You see," Marco said, "the house has provided us a drama. Finish it, and the new order begins." I watched the gun rise and in that moment understood what the soldier in me always knew: hesitation kills the wrong people. There was no time to weigh the poet's morality, there was only a human being about to be shot for a set of sins that had been redistributed like currency. I fired first. The shot was not thoughtful, it was a calculation of timing and trajectory learned in cold rooms and on salt-stiffened docks. Marco's body folded like a marionette whose strings had been cut. He hit the floor with a sound that seemed incongruously small compared to the thunder of the moment. The room breathed in and out as if recovering from a held scream. His men faltered. Human beings who are told what to do rarely recover from the novelty of seeing the plan undone without the hand that ordered it. In the lull that followed, I turned the gun slowly toward Valente. The metallic weight in my palm felt like an old friend and an accusation all at once. I should have killed him. In the months, in the years, I had rehearsed the scene where everything was made right by a single act of lethal justice. I had walked imaginary corridors to a man I had never met and practiced retracting his breath. But standing with the gun in my hand and Marco's blood in the carpet, the horizon of narrative that had fed my life altered. Valente's face was not the face of pure villainy, his eyes contained things that made my practiced hatred falter: regret, the ragged comprehension that his hands had been involved in a long series of small violent arrangements, a life held together by bargains that had been convenient at the time. I felt my internal argument, the ledger of debts and due, unraveling like a spool of thread. The man I had been taught to kill looked to me not as an enemy but as a result of human compromises. My finger slackened on the trigger. I lowered the gun and let it hang in my hand, the action a heresy in the house where every problem is solved by removing a person. "I don't need revenge anymore," I said. The words felt like a surrender and a liberation, like the letting go of a rope that had been strangling me. Valente watched me as if I had delivered both a confession and a mercy. For a long and terrible second the world waited on the cusp of something like an answer. Then the Don made the choice he had been forced into by history and humiliation. His hand, which had once been quick to decree, trembled as he lowered his own weapon. "Maybe I killed the wrong man all those years ago," he said, and the sentence was thunder in a quiet place. It was not an apology, it was a mapping of regret that neither healed nor excused but simply noted what had been. Elena broke from the place where she had been held and rushed to me. She crossed the room as if a tether snapped and something essential had been released. When she reached me, our eyes met, eyes that had held laughter, quiet conversations, and now the weight of confessions. There was an enormity in that gaze, a presence of everything unsaid. We did not need to speak, the air between us carried the heavy syllables of what had happened: betrayal, confession, mercy, and a kind of raw, terrible tenderness. Around us, the house breathed out. Men prostrated, some in prayer, some in shame, and some in the mechanical insistence of business as usual. Marco's corpse was a punctuation that announced an end of an era and the awkward birth of something else. The question that had lodged in me months ago, whether forgiveness that costs everything is worth it, hung like a banner over the ruin. I had killed the man who had made me monstrous, and I had refused to kill the man who had been complicit in my father's death. In that refusal, I felt the first sputter of something like peace, which tasted faint and strange as new bread. The evening slid from terror into a brittle kind of resolution. Elena took my hand, not with a triumph but with a carefulness that felt like prayer. Valente did not storm off in rage. He sat down slowly and held his head as if to keep it from toppling. The house would have to rearrange itself, alliances would have to be retooled, and the family would have to confront the portion of its history that was not cinematic but composed of small, repeated choices. I had walked into the lion's den for a revenge that had been mine by contract, and I left with a body on the floor and a different question in my hands: when forgiveness costs everything, is it still worth it? The answer, if ever there is a single one, would be written not in a salute or a grave but in the days that followed as we picked through what was left, as we learned whether a man who had been built of vengeance could be rebuilt into something else. For now, in the residue of gun smoke and broken crystal, the house held a fragile silence where we could all, perhaps for the first time in years, hear our own breath. The smoke from that night never really lifted, it only settled deeper into the bones of the house, into the pores of the walls that had once heard laughter and secret pacts whispered under chandeliers. They rebuilt what they could in the following days, sweeping glass into piles, washing blood from marble floors, burying the dead with the dignity owed to servants of power. But the Valente Empire, so proud, so absolute, did not rise again. Empires rarely die from the wounds of their enemies, they rot quietly from within. I remember watching the aftermath as if I were a ghost still tethered to the scene of my own haunting. Marco's coup had not only failed, it had exposed the machinery beneath the surface. The alliances, the bribes, the small loyalties traded for survival, all of them came to light like corpses surfacing after a storm. Valente's remaining men were loyal to the paycheck, not the principle, and when the river of money began to dry, so did their obedience. They vanished one by one, taking with them pieces of the empire they had once sworn to protect. The city that had bowed before the Valente name began to whisper it differently, not with fear, but with curiosity, the way people speak about old myths that might no longer be true. Don Valente himself was never the same after that night. I saw him only once in the weeks that followed. He sat on the veranda, the sea beyond him gray and heavy, his hand wrapped around a glass of wine he hadn't touched. He looked older than the sea itself. His eyes were not the eyes of a conqueror anymore, they were the eyes of a man who had begun to see the architecture of his sins. We did not speak. I think he understood that words would only make the silence between us unbearable. I left before dawn, taking nothing from that house except the weight I had carried into it. They say I disappeared, and perhaps that's true. A man can't stay in a world once he's burned its story to ash. I walked without a map, moving through cities that smelled of salt and diesel, changing names as easily as shirts, until the streets began to resemble the ones I had left behind years ago, the slums of Palermo, the crooked alleys where I first learned what hunger could teach. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent a lifetime climbing out of the gutter, only to find myself back where it all began. But the slums had changed. Or maybe I had. The children who played there had my eyes, sharp, suspicious, but still capable of laughter. The market still sold counterfeit perfume and broken promises, and the men still talked too loudly about money they didn't have. Yet there was something comforting in the filth and noise. It was honest. There was no empire here, no illusion of power, just people surviving the only way they knew how. I rented a small room above a bakery that smelled of burnt sugar and rain. I took work where I could find it, fixing engines, carrying crates at the docks, mending fences no one cared to claim. The anonymity was a kind of salvation. I learned to speak less, to let my hands do the talking. For the first time in years, my nights were not filled with the sound of gunfire but with the soft rhythm of the sea beating against the shore. Sometimes, though, when the wind shifted and carried the scent of jasmine from the hills, I thought of Elena. She had survived that night, scarred, yes, but unbroken. After her father's death, she stepped into the vacuum he left behind, though not in the way the world expected. She refused the council's attempts to restore the empire. She sold the casinos, dismantled the smuggling routes, and turned the Valente holdings into something resembling legitimacy. Factories reopened. Workers were paid instead of silenced. Her voice became known in circles where her father's power had once ruled by fear. They called her La Donna di Ferro, the Iron Woman, though those who had known her father whispered that she ruled not with iron, but with conscience. But even conscience is a lonely crown. The people loved her, the politicians tolerated her, yet there was always a question that followed her like a shadow: how much of her power was bought with blood? One morning, as the city began to heal from its ghosts, a letter appeared beneath her door. No name, no return address, just her name written in a handwriting she had once traced along the inside of her palm. "You were the only thing that made me forget why I wanted revenge." She read it once, then again, slower. The words carried the quiet ache of an apology without asking for forgiveness. She pressed her fingers to the paper as if to feel the pulse behind the ink. There was no signature, but she knew. The sea outside her window shifted, gray to blue, and she let the letter fall into her lap. A part of her wanted to send a reply, to find me, to ask if peace had been possible for a man who had lived too long in the shadows of others' sins. But she didn't. Perhaps she understood that my absence was the only way I knew how to keep her safe, from her world, from mine, from the remnants of who I had been. In the months that followed, I lived quietly. I watched the city from the docks, the skyline a mosaic of promise and ruin. Sometimes I thought about going back, about standing at her door and saying the words that had haunted me since the day I first met her: "I'm sorry for who I was, but not for what you made me become." But I never did. Some love stories aren't built for return journeys, they are meant to exist in the spaces between forgiveness and farewell. Still, I couldn't escape the ghosts. They followed me through the narrow streets, whispered to me in the creak of old boats, in the laughter of children who would never know the names that had shaped their city. My father's voice came to me sometimes, not in anger, but in the weary understanding of a man who had long since accepted his fate. "You did what you thought was right, boy," his voice would say in my dreams. "But don't let vengeance become your tomb." Maybe it already had. I began to write again, though the letters this time were not to my father but to no one at all. Pages filled with confessions, reflections, the small, ordinary details of days that felt borrowed. I wrote about the sea, the way it refused to be owned, the way it remembered everything but never said a word. I wrote about Elena's eyes, how they had looked at me the night everything burned, half fury, half forgiveness. And I wrote about the feeling I couldn't name, that strange ache between redemption and exile. Sometimes I left the letters tucked beneath stones on the pier. The tide would take them, or maybe some curious stranger would find them. Either way, they were no longer mine. I suppose that was the point. News of Elena's new world reached even the docks. They said she had turned the Valente estate into a foundation for orphan children, that she had opened schools where the only currency was curiosity. She had taken the blood-stained inheritance and tried to make it something clean. I wanted to believe she had succeeded. I wanted to believe that maybe, in saving me once, she had saved herself, too. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, I walked down to the shoreline. The air smelled of salt and endings. I carried a small pistol, the last relic of my old life. Its metal had dulled from disuse, its weight no longer a comfort. I turned it over in my hand, thinking of all the men who had lived and died by its logic. For years, it had been the extension of my will, my justice, my grief. Now, it was nothing more than a reminder of the man I no longer wished to be. I buried it in the sand where the tide could reach it. The act felt almost ceremonial, as if I were returning something borrowed. When I stepped back, the waves began to creep closer, the water licking at the metal until it disappeared beneath the foam. I stood there for a long time, watching. The sea didn't care about vengeance or forgiveness. It only knew the rhythm of return. Some say I died soon after, that I drowned, that my ghosts dragged me under, that I finally joined my father in the silence I had been courting my entire life. Others say I left the city again, wandering inland, working odd jobs, a nameless figure helping rebuild what others destroyed. Both stories could be true. Or neither. What matters is that Elena kept her promise. She built something from the wreckage, something alive. And sometimes, on clear mornings, she would walk to the edge of the estate, now a school filled with laughter, and watch the sea. The horizon always looked the same, endless, unanswering, and yet, in its vastness, forgiving. On one such morning, she found another letter under her door. The handwriting was shakier, older, but unmistakable. If I ever find peace, it will be because you believed I could. She read it once, pressed it to her lips, and smiled through the tears. When she walked to the shore that evening, the sun was melting into gold, and the waves carried a faint shimmer, as if hiding something beneath their skin. She whispered to the wind, not a prayer, not a plea, but a truth she had come to understand too late and just in time. Some wars end when love wins. The sea answered with its endless rhythm, indifferent and eternal. A wave rolled higher than the rest and fell back, revealing for a moment the glint of metal, a single gun, half buried in the sand. No one touched it. The tide rose again and swallowed it whole. And perhaps that was the point, that some stories are not meant to be tied with neat conclusions, that forgiveness is not a destination but a choice made quietly, again and again, against the noise of the world. The Valente Empire was gone. The boy from the slums was gone. What remained was a city learning to breathe without fear, a woman who ruled without cruelty, and a sea that remembered every secret and forgave them all. Because sometimes, the hardest revenge is not justice or violence or triumph. Sometimes, the hardest revenge is to forgive. If this story stirred something inside you, if you've ever had to choose between revenge and love, tell us what you would have done. Would you have walked away, or pulled the trigger? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories where loyalty, pain, and forgiveness collide, where every choice leaves a scar, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next CineVerse story.